Chapter 16 is our last chapter, and it deals with the nervous system. It's entitled The Neurological Exam, and it outlines some procedures, and just an outline of some procedures that are used to assess patients. And they can be done by a nurse, a doctor, a psychologist, but they can give us a rapid idea and help us localize damage to the nervous system. The neurological exam, includes several parts: the mental status exam, a cranial nerve exam, the sensory exam, the motor exam, and a coordination exam. And these test different things. The mental status, in large part, tests the function of different areas of the cerebrum. The cranial nerve exam will allow us to test the functions that are linked to each cranial nerve. In the sensory and motor exams, we're examining things that are often taken care of by spinal nerves. And then the coordination and gait exam is tests the function of the motor system, and in particular the cerebellum. Okay, so this little program is going to just focus on the mental status exam, which we'll talk about kind of an orientation and memory, and I'll talk a lot about memory. It talks about language and speech, and then judgment and abstract reasoning. This is various versions of this mental status exam are done often to assess patients, and particularly to assess their mental health well-being. And we look at the patient, at their attitudes, behaviors, mood, emotions, speech, thought processes, things like that. In doing so, we're largely looking at different areas of the cortex, the cerebral cortex, and we're talking about areas that are maybe involved in the prefrontal area, like with judgment and reasoning. We might be talking about areas like Broca's area and Wernicke's area that are involved in language, some sensory areas that are allow us to kind of figure out what's going on there. For us, one of the most important reasons of doing a mental status exam is to examine memory and to see if memory is in order. And we've talked about memory, and I've talked about memory a little bit, but it's important to kind of look at memory more specifically. And so here's where I'm gonna do that. And we have several types of memory. The biggest distinction in different types of memory is whether they are permanent. And we have sensory and short-term memory, which are not permanent. They're just held in our prefrontal lobe and only last a few seconds to a few minutes, and are very, very limited in the kind of information that's in there and how much. In other cases, we have long-term memory, and long-term memory can last days, weeks, months, years, sometimes even your whole life. And long-term memory, there's two types. We refer to explicit memories, and your book calls these episodic, which are retention of facts such as names, dates, and places, pieces of information you might learn like in a college course. And then we also have implicit memories, which again your book calls procedural, which are developing of skills, things like riding a bike or playing piano or driving a stick shift car. Those are memories that are different. They're not verbal memories, and they're memories on how to do something, and so kind of different. With memory, it takes a while to form memory. Sensory memory is kind of just being able to know that I'm walking through a room, and this is to my left and this is to my right, and you have this kind of representation of the room or something like that in your frontal lobe. And then short-term memory is kind of like the explicit memories. It's pieces of information that you can hold on, like a phone number, and you can hold on that for a few minutes and it'll come right back. But then with these short-term and temporary memories, they may be stored in long-term memory if there's repetition, if you have to recall that and use that piece of information several times, or if it becomes associated with something you already know or some emotion, it may be moved into long-term memory. And long-term memory, if it's explicit, that could still be lost over time. But if it's implicit, it will likely remain. And so that's things like learning to ride a bike. Even though you may not have done it for years, you can probably still do it because it's one of these implicit memories. This process of moving things from short term to long term memory happens primarily in internal parts of the temporal lobe, in regions called the amygdala and the hippocampus. We know this because we've had experience with people who've had damage to these regions. In some cases, specific patients that have had surgery or traumatic damage, and they're unable to form memories. They're unable to form new long term memories. And so these regions are really crucial for that. But the memories, the long term memories, aren't stored there. They're stored in other parts of the cerebrum. So these structures are involved in forming them. The kind of other interesting things is that's not the only function for these regions. These are part of the limbic system. And so they're involved in generating emotion and attaching emotional content to incoming sensory things, to associations with fear, and so there's these memories occur there. With procedural memories, these are going to be procedural memories are not formed using the amygdala and hippocampus. These things can go right into the cerebellum with repetition. So I've talked a lot about improving memory and the importance of repetition, but it's also important to link memories with multiple sensory inputs, to motor activities, and to previous experience or previous learning. This really helps store memory even without repetition. Also, things that are linked to limbic structures that generate emotion are easier to store as long term memories. And so people remember their first kiss or their first taste of, ice cream or creme brulee or something like that. There's also negative things associated with this because things that strongly stimulate fear or stress, these really strongly activate that amygdala. And so fear conditioning is very, very strong. And so stressful things really disrupt memory and they are really imprinted on our memory. And so this is, we know of this from experiences with soldiers that post traumatic stress disorder kind of hijacks this memory system and changes it for a long term. And of course, that's not limited to soldiers. That's any kind of stressful conditions can do this. We also know long-term memories are they require sleep and consolidation of memory. Moving of memory from short-term to long-term happens during sleep and during a particular part of sleep REM. And so a lot of the mental status exam is examining memory and seeing if people can orient themselves in their memories. Okay, another really important thing is looking at language and speech. Um, we know that language and speech is a really complex function that requires complex movements of the larynx, the tongue, and the back of the throat, and so it involves some really complex motor activity that occurs in Broca's area, but it also requires some really important processing of sensory information that occurs in Wernicke's area, which occurs in the temporal and parietal lobes. And so aphasia, the loss of speech, can be the loss of just the ability to express spoken word or the ability to understand it, or there could be damage to the communication areas in here. And so often in a mental status exam, they'll ask people to repeat phrases, to say certain things, to read and say it, and so these are assessing these language and speech areas. Okay, then they're also going to ask questions that will test people's judgment and abstract reasoning to see if people have normal thoughts and perceptions and cognitions, and so often they're looking for delusions. They're looking for uh, uh, the ability to do things in sequence, a correct sequence, to concentration, to make sure people don't have abnormal hallucinations or associations or conspiracy theory type thoughts. And so, we're not going to ask you to do the mental status exam, but to have an idea of what it is, that we're testing specific abilities that are taken care of in the cerebrum that can tell us a lot about a way a person functions and can point us to specific areas of the brain that are injured or not functioning correctly. Okay,